Hello again, and a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of UNDP. My name is Naja Hashimi. I am the electoral specialist for UNDP's regional office. I'm based in Amman, Jordan. I'm your moderator for this series of webinars on the impact of COVID-19 on elections. This is our fifth in the series, and we are happy to see so many of you returning. The COVID-19 pandemic is infringing on all aspects of our life, including on our political life, on our right to vote and be part of the electoral process. The global pandemic has forced governments and electoral authorities to make very difficult decisions on how to proceed with planned elections. To date, 66 elections have been postponed due to the virus, while 36 countries decided to go forward with elections. The decision on whether to postpone or hold elections as planned are complex, as we have come to know. If the decision is to hold them, there are discussions on how they should be organized. Will they be held using the same system and process as in previous elections? What measures will be taken to ensure the health of voters and poll workers on election day? How can poll worker trainings proceed under social distancing rules? What are alternatives to in-person voting, and are they feasible in the different contexts where we live and work? And what is the public sentiment to voting in the midst of an ongoing global pandemic? These are the issues facing electoral practitioners and experts around the world, including many of you in this webinar. UNDP is supporting governments across the different regions to make informed decisions on these issues and to ensure the integrity of the electoral process as efforts are taken to protect public health. This series of webinars are organized to support those efforts. They offer a platform to share ideas, lessons, and recommendations from countries that are in the midst of elections and election planning. Thus far, in the last 4 webinars we've had, we learned and heard from the experiences of Mexico, Tunisia, Korea, Bolivia, Georgia, and the US states of Wisconsin and Washington, DC. These cases included experiences of countries that have had to postpone elections due to the pandemic, countries that went ahead and held the elections despite the pandemic, and countries that continue to struggle with the decision on how to proceed. If you missed any of these discussions, you can watch the recordings on our YouTube channel. In today's session, we are bringing you another excellent and high-level panel of speakers to share how their countries are managing elections and election preparations in the middle of this pandemic. Both countries, the United States and Chile, have elections scheduled this year, and we are pleased to see that both countries are very well represented in our discussion today. The COVID-19 virus reached Chile sometime in March, and now the country has the 3rd largest number of cases in the region. The virus has devastated the economy with record unemployment levels and food shortages being reported in the largest and capital city of Santiago. When the virus hit, the country was still facing protests and riots that began in late 2019. As a result of the pandemic, Chile was forced to suspend the much anticipated constitutional referendum from April to October, as well as other elections that were all seen as a solution to the deep political crisis that the country's been facing. While there has been no national lockdown, mandatory quarantines were put into effect in some places, including in Santiago City. With the first set of elections planned for October, we'll hear from our speaker from Chile, the preparations that are underway to hold these elections, what the implications of having these elections will be on turnout, what the current mood of the public is towards holding elections in a time when people's priorities are to avoid being infected, and what measures are being taken by electoral authorities to ensure public safety. While there is great interest in any election taking place during COVID-19, the US, with one of the most complex electoral setups, offers a great learning opportunity as the country prepares for elections in which more than 100 million voters are expected to take part. As many of you know, elections in the US are governed by a complex federal system with no centralized electoral authority mandated to conduct elections nationally. Instead, each state is responsible for managing elections in their jurisdiction per their state laws. With the highly decentralized decision-making, there's a wide range of systems and processes in play in every election cycle in the US. Depending on the local office, Americans can vote by mail, they can vote early in person, or they can vote in their polling place on election day. As we heard from officials in Wisconsin and DC in previous webinars, the pandemic is presenting new challenges for these state officials. Now we see restrictions of movement as we witness a new wave of COVID-19 outbreak in certain parts of the country. We will learn from our panel today how the electoral process in the US is administered in general and during this pandemic, how election officials are responding to the changing circumstances, and what lessons we can take and see how they can be applied to the context where we work. We are grateful that all the speakers have agreed to be on this webinar and share their experience and expertise and help us discuss these issues today. We as UNDP hope you'll find them useful to the work you're doing on the ground. We encourage you to interact with the panel and each other in the chat box by sharing your comments, questions, and suggestions for future webinars. Let's try to make this as interactive as possible. Each of our panel speakers will speak for 10 minutes before we open for a 45-minute Q&A session, but please feel free to mention and write your questions in the chat box. Again, to people who joined, welcome. This session is available in Spanish, French, and Arabic interpretation. You can find the service on the Zoom menu. Osama, do you want to do the explanation again on how to access interpretation, or are we good?
I think we are good, Nadia.
Okay, great. Then I will turn to our panel. Thank you again to all three of you. We are very grateful to have our first speaker. He's a professor, Professor Toby James. He will open up the panel for us, providing a global perspective on where we are with COVID-19 in elections. Professor James is a leading expert on elections, electoral management, and political leadership. He has authored several books and numerous publications on elections. He's been following the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on elections very closely. He's written several blogs and pieces and articles on the latest developments. We are very happy to have him share this knowledge and expertise with us today. Professor James, welcome. We would like you to open up the discussion today and share what you have learned so far from your research and from your collaboration with different partners.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Nadia. And thank you to the UNDP for inviting me to speak. Greetings from very sunny Norwich, which is in the east of England, here in the United Kingdom. So my name is Toby James. As Nadia was introducing me, I'm an academic based at University of East Anglia. I'm also, earlier this year, I was a visiting academic at International IDEA. And I'm also convening something called the Electoral Management Network, which is a collaboration of academics and practitioners, so that we can, if you'd like, bring the textbook into the field, but also very much vice versa. So as academics can learn from the people that know the most about elections, which is actually the people on the ground very much running them. So hopefully you can see the screen, and I've been able to share that successfully. Is that come through clear?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So as Nadia was introducing the topic, COVID-19 provides us with one of the most fundamental challenges to democracy that we've seen, an unprecedented challenge. And so the figure here is from International IDEA's website, where they indicate that at least 66 countries and territories around the globe have decided to postpone their national elections so far. But at the same time, there are also many countries that have decided to go ahead with their elections, perhaps albeit at a slightly later date. And we've also had some electoral contests already take place during this moment, during this very difficult time. So I'm going to introduce, for the main part of the presentation, some of the ways in which the academic literature thinks that elections are thought to be threatened by natural disasters. And here I'm using some of my own research, but also research from those across the community. And it's very much the case that this research draws from the experience of past natural disasters, where they have taken place, because we have had epidemics and other types of natural disasters before, as well as some of that research that's ongoing at the moment. But at the end, I'll say something about how we as academics, if you like, need the input from practitioners so that we can generate the research that we think hopefully will then in turn help the practitioners. I'll say something about that in my final comments. So first of all, it's really important, I think, to think about what it means to think about electoral integrity. What are the benchmarks that we want to have for well-run elections? And rather than using, if you like, international standards and norms, what is often useful is to think about some key kind of guiding principles that we want to achieve. And there are 5 that stand out. These are not exhaustive, but the 5 that stand out. I'll talk about each of these in turn and how I think these are being undermined and threatened and challenged at the moment, and why therefore urgent responses are often needed. So the first one is about opportunities for deliberation. And in an ideal world, if you like, a well-run election would involve lots of discussion and deliberation about politics.
أو تنفيذ هذه الانتخابات السياسية يكون هناك الكثير من النقاش حول بعض المخاطر، ويمكن أن نقدم أو نتحدث عن هذه المخاطر وفي مناطق متعددة من البلد، وكيف يمكن أن
through a natural disaster. First is that often the media kind of infrastructure can be put under severe risk, particularly the case, for example, where you see severe floods, but also where you see national lockdowns. It's not possible for the media to report and hold politicians to account in exactly the same way. We often see campaign rallies cancelled. They're not possible for them to take place, and then instead there have been some innovations like photographed here in India, where the BJP put on online rallies, but they're not quite as participatory as they might be in real life. It prevents those forms of deliberation. And the public debate perhaps gets stifled around the management of the crisis rather than these broader sets of issues that are available. And there's lots of evidence from different studies that points to this. The second area of concern is about the equality of contestation. So that is, in an ideal world, what we would like is for there to be a level playing field for all candidates, all parties at election time. No, we never usually actually have that, of course, because the electoral system perhaps advantages some parties or candidates over others, and perhaps there's an uneven distribution of finance. But this is particularly a pressing problem at the moment where we have a natural disaster. To begin with, it might be very difficult for the opposition to go out and campaign in exactly the same way as they might do during normal times. Whereas if there's an incumbent who perhaps has access to state ownership of the media, it's much easier for them to put their messages out. We've seen examples in many countries of independent candidates withdrawing. It might be very difficult for someone to try to keep on campaigning for another whole year if they have limited resources, if the election has been postponed. And the past literature also points to the problem about
y esto nos lleva al problema de la ayuda humanitaria.
expenditure.
Qui mettra l'accent sur les dépenses où le soutien électoral est très important. Donc, tout ça, ce sont des choses à prendre en considération. Troisièmement, c'est la qualité des participations. Pendant que les élections sont à leur meilleur étage, où il y a beaucoup qui participent à travers des nombres énormes. Nous voulons également avoir une participation parmi des groupes particuliers, parce qu'il y a des groupes qui sont plus favorisés que les autres, donc on veut avoir tous les groupes participer. Où est-ce que, comment ça s'est affecté par la crise? Ça, c'est un terme que les gens ne vont pas vraiment voter, parce que peut-être ils s'inquiètent pour leur propre santé, d'attraper le virus, et ils ont peur de la pandémie, et donc il est important d'avoir des politiques de mitigation en place, en particulier comme c'est un virus qui affecte les groupes de manière équilibrée. Donc, il y a surtout il y a quelques parties ou quelques segments des gens qui sont plus affectés que les autres, comme les recherches le montrent. Alors, il faut prendre tout ça en considération pour les voteurs. Alors, voilà où on est. Nous avons les élections internationales parmi ou à travers le monde. Et il y a des gens qui peuvent interpréter ça de différentes manières. Il peut-être qu'il y a un changement dans les autres élections. Il y a des cas où il y a eu une chute des nombres de voteurs dû à des différentes raisons et changements. On peut attribuer ça, bien sûr, à la pandémie et au virus, mais aussi il y a des cas comme le Sud de Corée qui met l'accent déjà sur la tension internationale où il y a vraiment une crise durable. Alors, les chiffres ici, ça indique le nombre de cas indiqués dans le pays. La situation en Sud de Corée, c'est quelque chose d'important qui se passe là-bas. Et ça va bien sûr influencer les élections. Ici, je ne vais pas parler beaucoup des élections américaines parce qu'il y a un autre intervenant qui va en parler. Mais ce que vous voyez ici, c'est que c'est les changements dans
presidential election in 2016. These are ordered in terms of time-wise. So you see towards the top here, March, where you do see quite sustained declines. And perhaps towards the end there, you're seeing postal voting practices being put in place. Electoral management delivery is another area that's severely at risk. We've seen many cases around the world amongst our research of where you have a natural disaster, suddenly you have shortages in terms of poll workers, you have resources that become very difficult to access. And there's going to be a knock-on here as well. If you postpone an election this year till next year, there are some severe risks in terms of election backlogs as well. So you may, for example, have several consecutive several different types of elections held concurrently, perhaps even with different electoral systems, and that's going to be very difficult to manage. And the last area, before I think about best practices, is about rule certainty. And the great thing about elections is that they set out the rules of the game, and everyone knows and understands what the rules of the game are. They encourage people to try to gain power actively through peaceful mechanisms, through the ballot box, rather than through violence. But the surrounding circumstances of COVID means there's been huge uncertainty about whether an election will take place, whether it will not take place. And so there is a danger here that of both incumbents perhaps trying to exploit this and pick the timing of their advantage, but also perhaps for oppositions to make unfair claims about incumbents. And this is really a time where cross-party consensus is really, really important. So some of the emerging research points to best practices then. Safety mechanisms in poll stations are obvious ones, but I don't think, and the research is still to come really here, but I don't think these have always been in place in many countries. I think if you look on the social media on election day and you see the photographs, whether it's from Malawi or wherever else that's holding the election, is there really social distancing being taken place de facto in these areas? I think there's some questions there. Extending voting over many days is an obvious policy solution, provided you can get sufficient poll workers to do that. Expanding postal voting again makes lots of sense, but probably is problematic where countries or states have no prior experience of postal voting, because it does take a lot of time to get these new mechanisms up to speed. And that illustrates how perhaps avoiding late legal challenges is particularly problematic too. You don't want to introduce the major changes to the rules very, very late on, because you undermine legal certainty, and that can make the election very difficult to deliver. One factor I'll point out here is the importance of inclusive consultation and decision making. I mean, I would argue it matters not just what decision is made, but who makes that decision and how. Have practitioners, for example, asked disability groups about their needs and their concerns about the forthcoming election, and therefore use that information to put in practice supporting mechanisms. Where you have inclusive decision making, you are going to have much better elections, and you're going to have much better confidence as a result. Just finally, just a couple of notes about the role of the academic community in all this. I say with a colleague, Holly and Garnet in Canada, we run something called the Electoral Management Network, which is really simply, in many senses, an email list, or a way of receiving information and then spreading it out about new research around the world. And we sometimes hold conferences there. And I'd encourage encourage everyone, including practitioners, to join that. And through that network, during this year, we're going to be publishing case studies on COVID-19 elections. So we have a case study already available on France, and we have one on Poland coming up, and there'll be more dotted up across the year. We'd also be really keen to work with practitioners in running something called poll worker studies, where we basically distribute surveys to electoral officials on the ground to work out exactly what is going on, because it's very difficult to establish this where perhaps you haven't got overseas electoral observers. So please do get in contact if that's something of interest. And finally, just to say that the presentation here is based on 2 research papers that are at different stages of publication, but if you get in contact, I would be very, very happy to share those. Lastly, thank you so much for listening, and very much welcome all of your questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very enlightening. It was interesting to see that only 2 elections have had higher turnout. I mean, not surprising, but still interesting analysis. You know, poll worker shortages have been affecting all the EMBs that we've had on this panel, and the issues of resource scarcity, both human and financial. Fantastic that you share on that network. It'd be great if you can also share the link with the participants here in the chat box. I think there are fantastic resources there on your website as well. I'd like to move to our second speaker, Mr. Thomas Hicks, Commissioner Hicks. Thank you for joining us today from Virginia, I believe. Commissioner Hicks, Commissioner for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the EAC. The EAC was created in 2002 as an independent bipartisan commission charged with developing guidance for states and local governments on elections, adopting voluntary voting system guidelines, and serving as a national clearinghouse of information on election administration. Mr. Hicks works closely with all state election officials in their preparations for elections, and he is best placed to share with us how the U.S. election administration works, how preparations for the upcoming elections are going, and what measures are being taken to ensure public safety and at the same time the integrity of the process. Commissioner Hicks has extensive experience, as you can see from his bio. He's been engaged from many different angles on elections. We're very grateful that you're here. Thanks again, Tom. I'd like to pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I want to, let's see if I can share my screen and do the presentation. So thank you so much for inviting me. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm Tom Hicks. I'm Commissioner at the Election Assistance Commission, and our mission basically is to improve the administration of elections and participation for all Americans in the process, whether or not they're based here in the United States or if they're Americans voting overseas or in the military. I know it might seem from some of the news reports that you've been hearing and some of the politicians who are out there that the country is in chaos. That is somewhat true because of COVID-19, but overall, I think that election officials have done a decent job in some of the aspects of what they've had to face here. Overall, the EAC, we've distributed over $4 billion since 2002 to improve the process of elections, whether or not that is the purchase of new voting equipment. I'll talk a a little bit about COVID funds more recently, but we serve as a national clearinghouse on all things that talk about elections. And that's not just for election administrators, but that's also for voters. So the one piece of regulatory authority that we do have is the National Voter Registration Form, which allows people to register for federal elections using our form, which is based on our website at eac.gov. Right now, we are working, even during the pandemic, to update our voluntary voting system guidelines. And those are the guidelines that are used for voting equipment. And we certify voting systems on a voluntary basis. And we accredit 2 testing labs. One is based in Colorado and one is based in Alabama. The voluntary voting system guidelines have not been truly updated since 2007. And most of you might remember that back in 2007, the world was introduced to this little new phenom that was that basically changed the way we communicate, and that would be the iPhone. So if you think back to voting system standards not being updated since the first iPhone came out, you can see some of the problems that we are having with our systems overall. So my fellow commissioners and I are looking to update those standards, and hopefully we'll have those done relatively soon. That will not be in time for this election, but we hope that they will be in effect to affect the next election process. As you heard before, the American electoral system is very decentralized. There's basically 50 different jurisdictions. Basically, each state runs their own election, but there are over 8,000 jurisdictions in the U.S. And basically, there is an election run, and this is what's not well known, is that every year there's basically an election every Tuesday somewhere in the United States, whether or not that's for dog catcher or whether or not that's all the way up to the presidency. But every year there is at least one election on every Tuesday, barring holidays and so forth. And so we see how elections are being affected during COVID-19. And I would say that one of the things that is a strength of this is that it's decentralized. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is the effect and why it's a little bit of a strength. One of the things that also is not truly known of the American electoral process is that the people who run the elections on a local basis also do a number of different jobs, whether or not that is certifying or providing marriage licenses, or some in Texas I heard that some
your voice is coming in and out a bit.
Oh, really? Maybe if I sit a little closer, maybe that's it.
That's really good, thanks.
Okay. Some of the election administrators have issues with some of the things that they do. They do more than just administer elections. For instance, in Texas, they also issue the brands for branding cattle. Some folks do marriage licenses. In some places, I've even heard of the election administrators actually driving the school buses as well. So they do a number of different things. And this wheel talks about some of the things they do just in the realm of elections. ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, they deal with security, technology, public relations in terms of dealing with the media and so forth. But to prepare for the elections, they deal with mail. Every state has some form of mail-in balloting. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's mostly, most states allow for it to be postmarked and then received. It's done a lot of different ways. Some states allow for you to request your ballot. Some states send it out automatically. For instance, the states of Washington, Colorado, Hawaii, and Utah, and Oregon all vote by mail. So that means that they send their constituents their ballots each year in each election, so that they can participate in the process. You probably heard a lot about how that might contribute to fraud. That is not necessarily true because of several things that go on with elections. For instance, this past Tuesday, there was an election in my state of Virginia where I had to request my mail-in ballot. So when I requested my ballot, I had to enter into the website unique information. That's my driver's license number or social security number, my address, and my signature is also on file. So when I sign that ballot, when I send it back, it will, they have to match that up. So there are several precautions taken into place so that election can be validated. So the U.S. Election Assistance Commission deals with the administration of elections, but there is the Federal Elections Commission, which deals with campaign behavior and campaign finance. And there's sometimes some confusion of our two agencies, but we're the only agency that deals with the administration of elections overall. More recently, we've had to deal with other federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Voting Assistance Program, the Department of Justice, the Census Bureau, and Postal Service to help with the administration of elections. And I would never think that in the 5+ years that I've been at the agency that I would ever say that we had to deal with the Center for Disease Control. But this year we've worked with them to talk about how polling places can be made safe, or if people are voting from home, to ensure that those things are done safely as well. In 2017, at the end of the Obama administration, elections was designated as critical infrastructure. And what does that mean? It means that it was elevated to the same level of banks, our electrical grid, our waterways, to say that if there was an attack or if something destroyed it or became incapacitated, the assets that would be needed to make that whole again are going to be devoted from the government to ensure that those things are brought back up to speed. So that's a great thing. Initially, it was looked at as being political because it was at the end of the Obama administration. But when General Kelly became Secretary of Homeland Security under the Trump administration, he kept that designation, and that issue of it being political was taken away. I sit on the Government Coordinating Council, working with our other government coordinating members to ensure that we talk about these issues on a bi-weekly basis and what is needed to ensure that our elections remain whole. There's also a sector coordinating council, which is basically our private sector partners that play a role in this as well.
Tom, can you get closer to the mic? We're losing you again.
I'm basically right over my computer. So why it's not, I don't know why it's not.
When you move, I think it shifts.
Yeah, okay. So I'm almost done with this. So on our website, we've developed a COVID working group to basically provide as much information as possible for state and local election officials to be able to deal with this pandemic and administer their elections as best that they can. So that can be found on our main webpage at eac.gov. Normally, in an election year, I would be traveling to as many states as possible, talking to election officials about the way that they run their elections. But in this pandemic, obviously, that's not the case. So we are doing these things more on a web basis. So some of the things that are on that website are vote by mail timelines and how things should be getting out, helping voters request a ballot in this time of the pandemic, the electronic delivery and marking of ballots, which some people are saying is basically internet voting, which it's not. And another thing that has been pretty huge is ballot drop boxes. So for jurisdictions to have a drop box, so I could fill out my ballot, drive to the local government office, and drop that in a mailbox or a ballot box, so that it can be done, so that folks have confidence that the process is working well. Because there is the underlying fact that some people don't believe that the mail process is one that allows for all parties to participate equally. So we've also had a number of public hearings that allow for people to hear from election officials and advocates, and those who have disabilities, or election officials, how they are actually improving the process. And those can be found on our website as well. We've had a number of video series where we've talked to election officials and others about the way that they are dealing with this, so that come November, that people can be very prepared for the election process. In March, we distributed out $400 million to the states to help with the coronavirus. It was under the CARES Act. There are several members of Congress and the Senate who are talking about giving additional funds for this process, but in order for that to have an effect for our elections, which will occur in November, that has to be done relatively quickly. I would say that if we get that, if states get that money after August or into September, it may be not enough time for it to actually have a positive effect on the election. So what can those states use that money for? Paying for new paying for postage, purchasing new equipment, so that if you go to vote by mail, you can purchase high-speed scanners. One of the things that will be on display across the United States come November is that we will not know who won the election on election night. We might not know for a few days up to maybe a few weeks. And that's because of the mailing in of ballots overall. And so I will end there and take questions. But if folks have questions after this, this is my contact information and my Twitter account as well, so that if we don't have enough time for all the questions to come in, feel free to email me or contact me via Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions for you as we all closely follow the elections there. The numbers are huge, both in terms of the amount of money spent on these elections, the number of offices. Really, the undertaking is massive. And as we heard from other of your election colleagues, really there are changes happening every day on the ground with how they will approach the COVID-19 pandemic and the type of voting. And I know that there's already questions coming in, but I'll bring it to you later on. How do you ensure the integrity of the process with mailing? You know, there's a lot of questions around the fraud being increased if you allow ballots to be sent in by mail or through the drop box, as you mentioned. I'll bring that to you again during the Q&A. Before that, I'd like to go to our third speaker and final speaker, and we're very happy and humbled to have Ms. Martha Lagos here. She's a leading figure in Chile, in her country, and of course globally. She's been conducting public opinion polls during her country's transition to democracy. She's the founder of her own polling company and has worked with leading survey initiatives, including the World Value Survey. Her work has led to the formation of the Latino Barometer, and her expertise has supported other similar initiatives in Africa, in Asia, and more recently in the Arab region. She's very active, a member of her society. She's engaged in many local institutions. She's worked for the UN, including UNDP. She's worked with World Bank, with the US and European governments, and she's following developments on elections in her country very closely, and she has a good sense of the sentiment of the public through her work on polling. So we're very happy that she's here and sharing with us her experience of elections in Chile, how preparations are going, and what the public mood is. Martha, may I ask you to start? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to participate and to learn from the two wonderful speakers that preceded me. Well, Chile is a very small country. We are at the tip of the, in the south, at the tip of the continent. We have only 19 million inhabitants. Our electoral system and election procedure has been, I would say, exceptionally up to speed in rendering very valid elections. We have had no perception of fraud in elections ever. Has it been an election with a complaint that it has not been a clean and fair election. This is the Chilean tradition. Institutions of election, the Electoral Commission, have been extremely efficient. Our elections are rendered the same night before 10 o'clock. We always know the results. Even the plebiscite in 1988 that defeated the dictator, which is a completely unusual thing in the whole world, was known and finished by 10 o'clock. So we have a very good tradition of rendering and performing, and election day process. Everything is very orderly, but it is all very antiquated. It is all done on paper. It is all done transporting ballot boxes physically from one place to another. This very good system, nobody has dared touched because it works so well. This implies a number of problems for the new conditions of the post-pandemic time. I would also stress on another aspect that has impact today in the post-pandemic time, which is participation. We returned to democracy in 1990 with a very extraordinary participation that was called the revolutionary participation, when 90% of the voters voted in the first election that defeated the dictator in the first place and then elected the first president and the first parliament. Ever since 1990, electoral participation has been declining. In order to stop the decline of electoral participation, and because of compulsory voting, in 2012, Parliament decided to change from compulsory voting to voluntary voting. And this was exactly the contrary of what should have been done, because the first election, which was a local municipal election that took place in 2012, participation dropped to a historically low 15 points, depending on the county council. And ever since, we have had very low participation. So our problem today is twofold. One is, how do we get voters out there again? We know that we have an older generation that participated in this historic transition to democracy with full participation. And we have 2 generations of younger voters who have decided not to participate at all. There are cohort ages where there is no participation at all, or maybe only 10 or 15%. So that's one of the issues that is pending today, because the biggest fear of the next elections to come, which I will describe immediately, is the absentees, is those who will not turn out to vote. Now, how do we do it? How do we formally go forward with a process that will give those voters thing? And the other thing is, how do we transform our paper system into another system that allows us to perform elections? Because it is clear today, we are at the end of June, we have not reached the peak of the pandemic, it is clear today that by the 25th of October, we will not have a normal circulation as before, and therefore the the normal election procedure will be almost impossible to sustain in the same way. So people are talking about absentee ballots, mail ballots. Now, we are not England, and people don't write here. Postal offices are still existing, but if you send a post by mail, ordinary mail within the city of Santiago, it take 2 weeks to get to the other end of the city. So our postal system is also very antiquated. How do we update these? The Electoral Commission, which is a very well organized in a concept that is no longer up to date with the world, that is under-financed. I was listening with great envy to the amount of resources that the American election commissions have. There's little money for elections here. Although elections are very expensive, the Electoral Commission is not working properly. Well, this is the context in which elections have been postponed here. Because one of the elections had to take place on the 25th of April, which was the referendum on the Constitution that was produced in the popular uproar that was in October last year. A referendum was decided to take place on the 25th of April, and it was postponed until the 25th of October. That's the first election we will have in the post-pandemic time. The second election, which was supposed to take place in October, is now postponed until March, April next year. And in that elections, they have compiled all the other elections. So we will have county council, governors, council members of the county councils, and if the reform of the Constitution is approved in the referendum of October, we will also have the election of the members of the Constitutional Assembly that will design the Constitution. So we have 4 elections and 1 in April. And then we have the regular presidential election, the first round in November and the second round in December. So within 12 months, actually 13 months, we will have 4 elections. This is an election tsunami for a country like Chile. It has never happened before in our history. We are literally, elites are freaking out with this idea that we will be in election mode for a year, for a full year, with, as I said, with a weak, or let me say antiquated, not weak, a properly old-fashioned electoral commission, underfunded, with a political system and party system that is also underfunded and I would say in very many aspects informal, where we will have problems with election rules, campaign rules, election accountability of spending money, election competition, etc. And we will have problems in all the aspects of the procedure of how to do 4 elections in one, like the one that's taking place in April. And then the question comes, what, and this is what's being discussed today here, is what happens if the election on the 25th of October, on the referendum of the Constitution, the new Constitution, has to be postponed again. I think the most interesting question that was posed this morning to me is when is it democratic to postpone elections? I mean, how much can a society sustain as saying it is legitimate to continue postponing an election that will push all other elections ahead? Because, as I said, the Electoral Commission is rather antiquated, and therefore it takes 4 months. This election commission takes 4 months to prepare an election. There cannot be more than less than 4 months distance between one election and the other. We don't have the system, we don't have the resources, we don't have the infrastructure or the institutions that can perform that. So are we going to be able to change the election mode and vote by mail? Is there enough time? It's already June, the election is in October. Can we change the way we vote and still produce an election? Are we going to increase our rules for election competition within this new mode? Because as other speakers also referred to, this remote participation has, of course, a social divide, because in a country that has, you know, a very high per capita income like Chile, we have about $22,000 per capita income, but a very, very high divide between rich and poor. So this leaves about at least a third of the population unable to participate, or maybe less able to participate remotely in elections that are not face-to-face. And so the challenges of these elections to come this year in the post-pandemic time, 4 elections in 1 year, will stress the Chilean political system that is already stressed, because we have today a very polarized political mood in the country. The pandemic has posed upon the social unrest that started in October of 2019 a second stress, which is the economic recession on top of the social demands that were already there. Meaning that, you know, Chile will live most probably in the next 18 months the most, I would say, turmoil situation of political situation that has lived since the independence 200 years ago. I would say this is going to be a very difficult time. It's going to be a very demanding time, and the challenge here is to be able to preserve this tradition of having free and fair elections, which we have had in the past, in these very, very complex updates that the country needs in its institutions in order to perform elections in a different mode as the normal face-to-face elections. And there is an enormous amount of propositions on the table that regard with election day. For example, one very important one is the distance of the voters with the voting place. In the old times, you would get on a bus and you would ride a bus for 20 minutes and go vote in a particular place. You were assigned a particular place. Well, there has been no dispersion of voting places in Chile in the last elections. And therefore, you know, people will certainly not get on a vote, on a bus 20 minutes to go and vote, even if the pandemic has really slowed down. That's a change that needs to come anyway. The other thing is, do you pay the bus for those who have to go to vote so that participation increases? Because we know that people do not go to vote because they don't have the money to pay the bus to go to vote. The other thing is, how do we convince people that the options, the possibilities, the electability of new people into the system is fair? One thing is to have election days very fair, and the other thing is to have a competitive process that allows different diversity of views to become available to the voters. And so we also challenge the problem of, we also have the challenge of the participation, to recover the participation of the newer generations. Of this is not a socioeconomic divide, this is a generational divide that goes from the rich youngsters to the poor youngsters with no difference at all. This is a generation that was raised and socialized in democracy. In this democracy we have built since 1990, and that we have been unable to convince these people that it is necessary for a democracy for people to vote. So as you can see, Chile is we will be a guinea pig, and I'm sure there will be many people observing the performance of this country because of these very special characteristics I have tried to explain. And we are, of course, welcoming all sorts of support and help in the designing of the new way of voting, hopefully with higher levels of participation than before. And that's one of the reasons why many members of parliament are proposing to go back to compulsory voting again, trying to increase the level of participation and therefore trying to decrease the crisis of representation that politics is undergoing in the country at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martha. You have really vividly taken us into Chile, where Chile is today on elections and the many layers of challenges that you face. You have a strong foundation, so that's great to hear. But you have many challenges, not least of which is the pandemic itself. Thank you for sharing that. I know in the Q&A, it would be great to hear if you could elaborate a bit more on some of the more specific process-related concerns that are coming out from stakeholders. I know you're engaged in a lot of polling. What are civil society and other stakeholders saying? I will bring this back in the Q&A, which we will start now. We already have questions coming in, but for those of you who still have questions you haven't written in the chat box, please share them now. We will start asking our speakers. If I can start with Professor Toby. You shared sort of criterias and standards, and I wanted to sort of look at the broader aspect and question coming in on what do you see as the impact of these challenges on democracy in general, not so much on the technicalities, but do you see with the restrictions imposed on how elections are held and the low turnout, what do you see as the overall risk for where democracy is headed? If you can touch on that very quickly. Thanks.
Thank you, Najat. Just to say, firstly, I've learned a lot from the previous two presentations, so thank you ever so much for those. It's a great question. Yeah, what is going to be the longer term impact on democracy? I mean, in some respects, I guess the presentation speaks to that because elections are essential for democracy. And so these kind of 5 dimensions that I look at in terms of participation being affected, these are all kind of absolutely kind of crucial for understanding that. But one of the things we do know through comparative research is that when you do have times of emergencies, national emergencies, states tend to impose emergency powers and lockdown powers. And there's a really interesting paper that just came out of the Varieties of Democracy project where they show that during those national emergencies, democracy declines and then does not tend to recover. So there is a major risk of a kind of global recession in terms of democracy, without being too dramatic about it. That really is the case. You did see a dip in terms of the trends of autocratization taking place in the kind of 4 or 5 years prior to that anyway. And so there is a major risk here that when emergency powers are put in place, that these will not be released around the world. So, I mean, clearly it's a big question. It's going to be impacted very unevenly everywhere. But at the headline, a simple answer is probably that one.
Thanks, Professor. Not an easy question to answer or to reflect on in these times. Can I go to you, Tom? We have a question from Palestine and asks about your role with states? You mentioned that it's decentralized. What sort of is your communication or your authority and your interaction with states? If you can touch on that a bit.
So it's basically, thank you for that question. It's basically a carrot and stick approach. So the U.S. Constitution lays out time, place, and manner. But as a non-regulatory agency, the way that we get states to actually conform to some of the changes that we would like to see is by giving them money. We've given over $4 billion since 2002. The $400 million that we just gave this year sounds like a lot, but in the overall scheme of things, when the CARES Act was over $3 trillion, that's a very small piece of it. Elections are usually looked at as the last possible thing to be funded, and we are in a really precarious place right now because we're expecting over 150 million people to participate in the process come November. And so, you know, when you have a candidate who won the election and still claimed, and this is not a political statement, but when you have a candidate who won the election claiming fraud, if there's a possibility for him to lose in November, I know that there's going to be questions about the legitimacy of the election. And I'm happy to talk about the mail-in ballots if anyone wants that to be part of the next question or a question.
Yeah, maybe if you can, while you're still on the mic, touch on that, particularly on the issue of fraud, how that increases fraud, how you're addressing it, or how state election administrators are addressing that.
Right. So fraud can be committed with any sort of election process. So, but the overall chances of fraud being committed through the mail are very low. For instance, like I stated earlier, I have to request my ballot. I have to use a unique identifier to request that. When I send it back, it has to be checked via my signature and other aspects of it as well. If I were to request someone else's ballot, there would be a postcard that would be sent out to the address that was previously put on there. So if I lived at 123 Main Street and I requested a ballot for 135 Main Street, a postcard would go out to that previous, similar to when you receive something saying, did you mean to make this change through email? You know, and so there are safeguards put into place, but it's going to be an increase in the number of people participating in it. So it's a scalability issue. For instance, for Georgia that had an election less than 2 weeks ago, they usually have about 20 or 30,000 mail-in ballots requested. That was increased 5-fold. So over 100,000 people requested a mail-in ballot. So there's going to be a number of people who are sending those in, and to have those counted. The other aspect of that is, since there is not the faith in the mail system overall for some issues, if you don't receive your ballot, then people are still going to the polling places to cast their votes. And there's going to be an increase in lines, an increase in the amount of time it's going to take to actually get the election counted and certified at the end of the day.
You mentioned it could take up to 2 weeks to know the results on November 6th or more.
I would point back to our election in 2000, where Al Gore and George W. Bush ran. That election was not truly decided until December, where the Supreme Court stepped in. So that was 20 years ago, and I'm not going to say that that's going to be the case this time around, but there is precedent for the election still being in question or the top race still being in question a month later after polls have closed.
Well, we wish all the election administrators there in the U.S. Luck. We know that you're supporting them closely. I'd like to go to Martha. We have a question on Chile. One of the audience members would like to know if there is a change in the process or in how elections are conducted. What impact do you think this will have on the level of trust that there is in the process currently? Do you think there will be any effects?
Well, thank you for the question. Well, that's a crucial question in Latin America because we are the most continent that has a lower interpersonal trust according to the World Values Survey, and our trust in institutions according to the Latino Barometro is extremely low, and therefore we also have trust in electoral commissions. Electoral commissions and electoral process tend to have in Latin America higher trust than many other democratic institutions. One of the, I would say, the leading examples in this is Mexico. Mexico did a transition, and the transition was made by the Electoral Commission, which is today a very important institution in the country. So I think it will change. In the case of Chile, because of the excellent performance in the past and the perception that there is no fraud in elections here, the impact of a mode change will most probably affect the competitive part of the election more than election day. So the process itself may not be affected as much as how will a competition be fair enough in terms of not being a face-to-face, a remote competition, and the fairness of the whole financing of this new form, etc. May be more a question than the result counting on election day. I think that is one of the things we can count on, to have enough institution to hold that. So, but trust is a major problem in Latin America, a major problem in Chile, and the pandemic is also having an impact on trust because people don't trust the government, they don't trust authority, they don't trust institutions. And this has nothing to do with the current government, it has to do with the last 7 governments. So as I said, there are cultural issues that have to do with the way we conduct elections today. And unfortunately, having a good election commission and a good election day is not enough to call people to participate.
Thanks. Yeah, we see these developments and the lack of trust not only in Latin America. I mean, it's happening all over the world. This sort of loss of trust and confidence in institutions. But it's great to hear that at least the electoral authority in Chile is strong. We hope things do work out for the best. I have another question. Maybe all of you can touch upon it, but I will put it to Toby. It's on sort of what are the best practices you're seeing on campaigning and the participation of parties, of candidates, of civil society in the process amidst these rules of social distancing and quarantines. What do you see in the landscape?
Thanks, Nadia. Yeah, it's a very difficult one. I mean, really, as I said in the presentation, one of the key principles that we want to try to enable is genuine deliberation around politics, and that becomes much more truncated when people aren't able to visit properties in person. I mean, so interestingly, in the US, actually, there's a bit of praise for the online debate where it took place without an audience. And one of the things that immediately changed actually was the nature and format of that, of that kind of contest, if you like. Whereas a participant would usually be looking for a very short, quick, crowd-pleasing catch lines, actually changed the dynamic into a much more kind of sustained, more serious debate, and actually caught some praise for that. So certainly, continuing with debates, albeit with social practices, social distancing, is something that can work. I think obviously online is the major way to go in terms of campaigning, but in many respects, parties and candidates have done a lot of that already. Social media is always, over the last few years, has become increasingly important for reaching voters. And obviously, there's been a lot of investment in terms of the data analytics kind of going behind that. So it seems that online is the only and the main way to go, but it isn't perhaps necessarily as much of a sea change as it might otherwise be.
Thank you so much. We're coming sort of to the end of our session. I still would like to give a couple of minutes to each of our speakers to sort of wrap up any final comments they may have, address anything that came up from the other presentations, and also address any issues in particular on the preparations underway and how electoral authorities can be further strengthened through the work that Martha and her organization is doing, sort of knowing what the sentiment of civil society, of the public is before they put in place changes. So I would ask maybe Tom if you could do some wrap-ups for 2 minutes, and then Martha, and then Toby, I'd like you to do some closing remarks.
Great, thank you. Again, I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Election Assistance Commission and some of the work we've been doing. I think that this election will be one for the record books, one that people will learn from, one that they will write a number of books about. I think that, it won't be decided on election night, but I think that we will still have record turnout. Every presidential election in the last 40 years, we've seen an increase in the number of people participating. And I'm predicting that we will have at least 150 million people participating in this election coming forward. The one question that I still have, and I'm still trying to work out, is that if we go to more mail-in balloting, what happens if those postal employees become injured or sick with COVID-19? That's one of the things that keeps me up at night. And I've done all I can to try to recruit additional poll workers, because we usually have about 1 million people participating in as poll workers. There usually are older people, 65 and older, which is not great for COVID-19. So we are doing our best to recruit younger poll workers and additional poll workers. So again, this won't be an election for the as usual, but I think that it will be an interesting one.
It's great that you touch on trying to bring in more young people into the process. We didn't touch on that, or on the issue of gender, which are important points. I know even on this webinar, we have several youth groups engaged. So maybe Martha, you can touch on those and other points you want to make just before we close.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think that, in fact, I agree with Thomas that this pandemic will trigger, most probably, more participation. People have been forced to see the state. They have been forced to engage in the national well-being and the national public policies that are being implemented through the country. So people who were very far away from interest in politics have been closer to politics because of the pandemic. And I think that because we're going to have elections right in the middle, or maybe at the end, God knows in what stage in the pandemic, there will be more awareness of what's going on. And this will bring, hopefully, more younger people to participate. But I also think that there's a further problem with the election that is being posed in Chile, especially, that has to do with the legitimacy of those who are candidates. There is an increasing, I would say, criticism on the current elite, that the current elite has not been up to speed, has not been able to produce whatever the demands of the people are. There's a failure, there's a lack of response from the part of the authorities that is also undermining the image of democracy and the image of the performance of the governments. And this will also, I think, affect, well, who is going to be a candidate? Recently in Chile, 2 weeks ago, there was a law passed that nobody who had been more than 3 terms in a certain elected position can be a candidate again. There will be a huge renewal of elites. And of course, younger people are coming in. The older generation is being pushed out forcibly. And this will probably have also a participation effect in calling younger people to vote for younger people. And within this renewal, the gender issue is very, very in the first line. We had a major participation of, I would say, a feminine revolution at the beginning of last year, which was a little, I would say, pushed under the rug because of the social. But this mobilization, massive mobilization of millions of women in the street asking for more gender equality is certainly going to have an impact also in this renewal of younger elites, and hopefully bring more people to participate. So as you can see, the scope and range of challenges we have go to all aspects of society and development.
Thank you so much, Martha. Yeah, the pandemic is really bringing to the forefront the good and the bad in all our countries, and forcing us to actually deal with many challenges that were there under the rug. So I think on elections, it's really great that we have you guys sharing your experiences. I know context matters. We hear, especially in this webinar, you know, the mail-in ballots are a norm in the US, but they don't really necessarily work in Chile because your contexts are very different. But sharing these experiences are valuable. I hope it is useful to the audience. There is a question coming in on technology. We won't have time to delve into it, but maybe you can touch on it, Toby, in sort of your wrap-up remarks. The question comes in from Iraq on, you know, how technology is being incorporated, especially as we look at sort of remote ways of voting that does not require us to be close contact with each other.
Great, thank you ever so much, Najia. And just to say, I very much hope that Martha's right in terms of voter turnout, and we do get lots of re-engagement in politics. It is very much needed. So I guess a couple of closing comments. One is it's very striking, actually, listening to the speakers, how much the world is actually facing common challenges here. It really is a sense that the electoral community is all in this together. And some of those challenges that Martha was talking about experiencing in Chile, there's certainly present here in the UK, issues like actually resourcing, issues like postal service during the pandemic, the question of combined elections. We're going to have a bumper set of polls coming next year, all with different electoral systems, all with different types of ballot papers. So good luck to the poor electorate trying to understand much of that. Questions about trust. You know, again, this is a global issue about trust. So there really is, I think, a sense that everyone's in it together in that way. And in that context, I guess one thing I'd flag we haven't said much about is communications, because you know, trust is dependent on what you expect to happen, really. And if people are going to expect immediate election results, you know, within hours of the poll closing, they're going to be disappointed because postal votes are going to take a long time to count. Early voting may cause some logistical issues. And so there's a real, I think, pressure on all the news networks and to kind of get this message out that you won't get an immediate result. And this doesn't mean that it's necessarily fixed or rigged or it's not run successfully. We just need to have a bit of patience for due process. I think that's really important there. And due process is really, really important for technology as well. I mean, I was admittedly myself, I thought, well, there's a pandemic, what do? We vote remotely. This is the internet opportunity. There's some pros and cons of internet voting, but one thing I think shouldn't happen is there shouldn't be a major quick rush to use technology, because it takes time, it needs to be tested, otherwise all kinds of much more serious problems can happen. And actually using tried and tested systems, I think, like early voting, pencils, pen and paper at polling stations, there's nothing necessarily kind of wrong with that. And just a final thing, just to say, do get in touch if you want to be involved in the network, and it'd be great, you know, if you wanted to run a poll worker study in your country, so we can kind of get more information about the challenges of what works, and we can feed that back in the coming months, for however long this process takes. But thank you again, Najia and everyone, for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Toby. For sure, the election world will not be the same after this pandemic. There's a lot that we are learning every day. Please feel free to contact the speakers directly. They've shared their contacts. We'll also be sharing the presentations, likely in our YouTube channel, where you can watch the recordings of this webinar and all of our other webinars. Again, I would like to thank all the speakers for joining us from your homes, and all of you participants. Thanks for attending. Again, many of the familiar faces, and I always forget to thank them, but I've been reminded, so thank you, translators. We would not be able to share this with the world like you're allowing us to. So thank you very much to our translators today. Just to let you know that we are also live on Facebook. So we have been, we have had audience there as well. And we are having good numbers continue. So I think this is a useful platform. We will have the next webinar in 2 weeks. Please follow us on Twitter and on our other social media platforms to know the topics and the speakers for the next lineup. Of course, if you have suggestion ideas, you know how to contact us. And really, we're happy, Toby, Tom, and Martha, that you were able to join us. Please stay in touch with us. Please join again next time as participants in our next webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.